and I think the best way to get into John the 23rd is to take a step back and look at Pius XII. And Pius XII, I think it's fair to say, was a complicated guy. He, on record, saved thousands of Jews from the Holocaust, but he refused to publicly condemn the Holocaust. What do you make of the man Pius XII?
Well, I think his legacy is forever. There's a real effort on the part of some very conservative Catholics to make Pius a saint. There's a campaign still underway to make him a saint, but his legacy will always be tarnished by the fact that throughout World War II, he had incontrovertible evidence of the Holocaust. He knew that millions of Jews were being slaughtered not that far away from Rome, and he remained silent on it throughout the war. And I think a lot of people felt he had an obvious obligation as a man of God to speak up to protest this horror, and he chose not to. And he was also very much of the mind of this sort of fortress church, that this is a church that is the only true church, and it won't really have dialogue with the rest of the world. It will shut itself off from the rest of the world. And with Pius's death in 1958, you have the arrival on the scene of the roly-poly old Italian
Yeah.
who's really gonna remake the institution.
So I've heard some of these arguments for Pius XII, not just if people want to make him a saint, that's one thing, but just arguments in terms of the reason why he may not have spoken out about the Holocaust. And a lot of people that are his defenders will say that if Pius XII spoke out about the Holocaust, that would have led to mass retaliation against the clergy, against lay Catholics by the Nazis. So, in essence, the devil's advocate argument would be more silence equals more saved. Is there any validity to that argument in your eyes for Pius XII viewing like using his silence as a weapon to save more Jews?
Well, I mean, most Jews weren't saved, so apparently if that was his strategy, it didn't work very well. And his argument was principally that if I speak out to save the Jews, the Nazis are gonna turn on the Catholics, that the Catholics will become the new Jews. I don't think there's much evidence that that would have been the case, if only because something like 45% of the German population was Catholic.
Mm.
And I think, you know, I as a great moral leader, doesn't the pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church have a responsibility to speak out about grave injustice? And I would argue just you don't have to give it much thought to realize, yes, he does have an obligation to speak out against injustice. And I think a lot of historians who've gone through the record recently, have gone through the Vatican archives, say that he proved to be a moral pygmy. He had an obligation to speak out and chose not to. And we also now know from the archives that a lot of his principal deputies were pleading with him to speak out, to do something that he could have saved lives had he spoken out.
Yeah, and as someone who grew up Catholic and going to church, I now I guess I would consider myself agnostic. I don't go to church. I don't practice. I don't pray, but I acknowledge the possibility of the existence of God. The things that the things that the Pope says now that make it to my ears have an influence on me, and they have an influence on billions of lay Catholics, non-Catholics around the world because for most people, the Pope is a symbol. The Pope is, if the Pope's saying something, people are gonna at least pay attention, whether they agree with the Pope or not. So, I mean, it does seem like even if Pius XII believed that him speaking out against the Holocaust would somehow get even more Jews killed, there would probably be a lot of people on the fence deciding whether or not they wanted to take action or whether or not, they were gonna take a stance in their own lives that would feel emboldened by the Pope, saying from the balcony talking, shit essentially to Hitler and saying this is an evil thing. You have to stop this.
Mhm. Yeah, and, as I say, something like half of the German population were
Mm.
Catholics, most of them devout, if the moral leader of their church stepped forward to say that your country's involved in this grave injustice, this slaughter of innocents, you'd have to think that would have been a real challenge to Hitler's hold on power. And there's also an element of hypocrisy here, which is that after World War II, Pius becomes this fierce Cold Warrior. He's denouncing the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc communist countries nonstop. So he's willing to protest that injustice. But during World War II, he wasn't able to protest, what would numerically be a far graver injustice by the Nazis.
How do you think the Holocaust may have looked different if the Pope took a super adamant stance against it at the beginning? I know it's tough to, talk about a situation that doesn't exist, but what do you think things could have looked like had Pius XII come out more sooner and stronger against the Holocaust?
Well, I say the evidence we've got now shows that he had incontrovertible evidence from very early days of World War II that of the final solution, this plan to commit genocide against the Jews. Imagine a world in which the Pope in 1940 had spoken up and said, the Vatican is aware of credible evidence that the Nazis are engaged in genocide, and gotten much of the rest of the Western world on board with that view. Um, it might have been harder for the Nazis to carry out the Holocaust as they did for the following 4
Yeah.
years.
Hey guys, if you like this clip, there's a lot more waiting for you. Join the Zach Show 2.0 to unlock the full video and audio version of this episode, plus bonus content you won't find anywhere else. Exclusive AMAs, the entire back catalog of premium episodes, and the ability to submit topics and questions for future shows. Subscribe today at thezachshow.supercast.com. I'll see you there.